Good afternoon, friends. Glad to see everybody here. We've got another strong group of people with interest in reimagining their company. We've had a great series so far. This is the fourth in our Reimagine series, and we're trying to take you guys back to when you first started your company, the dreams and hopes you had for a very dynamic, progressive company that was quick on its feet. It had an engaged staff. It had great parent interactions and communications and marketing strategies. It was financially stable, and it operated in a beautiful facility where the economics worked out. So we started with our marketing content. We went second week to staffing, bringing your staff back, how to keep staff engaged. Last week, we did a financial strategies as you reopen and reimagine your company. And today we're happy to have Mike Pepper from our team talk to you guys about your real estate, what it might look like for you as a tenant or a landlord, and what it might look like for you in the future. So happy to have Mike. Hi, Mike. I would also like to say that, sorry, I'm gonna move my computer. I'm so happy that this is happening in my background. That is our awesome Carrie Ferguson back there. Carrie is our transaction manager, and we have not seen each other in 2 months, and we are socially distancing across the office. So happy that she's over there and back, so I can see her. Couple of quick reminders. We would love to have you guys ask questions as we go. If you will hover over the top of your bar, your mine's at the top, you have a panel bar. There is both a Q&A icon and there should be a chat. Mine resides in the more section, but there is a chat. As Mike presents, I'll monitor chat, and sorry, Mike, but be as dangerous as possible in trying to answer the questions I can and save the really important ones for Mike. We will save time at the end for your questions, so feel free to keep those going as the content continues. We will tomorrow give you 3 things. We will have this webinar posted on our website along with all of the webinars we've ever done in our history, which is about 5 years worth of content, but all of the Reimagine ones for the last couple of weeks are there, and you can pick those up. This one will be posted by tomorrow. Carrie will also email you if you're a registered participant. Obviously you are, because you are here, unless you're listening to this later. Mike will reference several links, and Carrie will email those to you tomorrow along with a certificate for the training here. So Mike, thanks for joining. Let me talk about a couple more things. So as we said, we've got a couple of bits of news. Mike will discuss national conditions for early learning schools, strategies for tenants and operators, strategies for landlords and investors, and building on the future. So we're excited for that. We have, again, we're in the 4th week of our Reimagine series. I'd like to go ahead and tell you guys what's coming up next week, because it's a change from what we originally had planned. And then we have a very dynamic speaker coming for you guys in June to end the series. But next week, I am going to interview one of our favorite operators, Alita Mechtel. Alita is from Minneapolis, and she is right in the middle of navigating a teacher positive diagnosis for COVID, plus some children in the classroom who aren't feeling well. We don't know the results of that yet, but she is right in the middle of figuring that out with her team, with communications and protocols and processes. And we want you guys to have the benefit of her knowledge next Tuesday and how she navigated that, how she made a plan, how she implemented that plan, because we believe that this will probably happen to most everyone at some point. It's how we deal with it in a calm and prepared manner that will make the difference. So we're really excited about that. conversation next week. We launched last week our Thrive workshop, which we had originally planned for Portland, Oregon. We are now doing Sooner and Safer for you guys online on August 7th. We are over half full there. We limit that event to 100 participants because we want to meet with you virtually in advance. We want to help you think through your particular situation. We want you to join us in the live event. We want you to be able to ask questions and get the attention you deserve, and also participate in case studies with other participants. So go to thriveworkshops.com, thrive-workshops.com to register, and we would love to see you guys there. Last announcement is that the Hinge team has worked with Childcare Exchange magazine to produce a video series called From Surviving to Thriving. It is available and is free, and a new video is released every Wednesday. There have been 2 released, and the 3rd one is released this Wednesday. So get plugged into that and take a look at those. It's a very diverse group of speakers from all across the country and many different types of programs. And they're talking about technology in their programs and how that has really supported them recently. This week is the beginning of 2 weeks of staff strategies and keeping staff engaged. The content is really good, so look for that. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend Mike Pepper. And Mike, I will see you at the end for questions.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. How's the volume there?
Sounds good.
You got me?
Little,
okay?
Maybe get a little closer. Little faint.
Okay, how about now?
That's better.
Okay. Hello, folks. Thanks for joining for our real estate strategies seminar. And I read somewhere that one of the more effective ways to start a presentation is not to talk about statistics or how excited I am to be here, because I am excited, but to tell a story. And that story is, once upon a time, we believed that if you build it, they will come. And what I mean by that is you open your center, you picked a location, you did some marketing, and people showed up, the children showed up. And generally, that's been the case for a long time. Next slide, please. And for those of you that were in Miami and came to my real estate presentation, I wanted to show the general uptrend over the long period of time for the last 50, 60 years in looking at the powerful economic engine of the United States. And it really has lifted all boats, including the childcare industry. And so those of you who opened a center or opened multiple centers, you generally were riding an upward trend. And I totally believe in Warren Buffett's mantra, don't bet against America. Next slide, please. So here, we want to emphasize that the child care centers offer not only an opportunity for Mario and Susie and James and Jennifer to learn and socialize, but also a chance for mom and dad to get to work. But then, next slide, please. Oh boy. You all know what this means. We don't say the V word anymore at the shop. So anyway, anybody who's over 35 years old knows what this means. Next slide, please. So if you can see on the red here, the lockdown, it is going to and has created severe pressure on everybody. I'm not going to rehash what's been talked about on the news, but anytime you see a graph like this, it's very troubling. And, you know, we're losing hundreds of thousands of jobs and we're going into debt and everybody's anxious. Nobody has all the answers. We got people yelling at each other from the far right, from the far left. Our job here today, next slide, please. Our job here today is to give you some tools to fight it. So pardon the mixed metaphor. We went from Wizard of Oz to King Arthur, but at Hinge, where we try to be creative and keep it a little bit light. So here's some thoughts and ideas. Here's what's going on a national level. When the virus first hit, there were many closures, and but if you really drill down into it, not every state is closed, and there's not a distinction between red states and blue states. California is open, for example. Texas is open. Vermont is closed. Illinois is closed. Maryland is closed. Colorado is open. I think what's more going to be a problem is the group size change, where many of the states now are indicating that the max group size is going to be 10. And for a data point, we use statistics that we got from the Hunt Institute, and when Carrie sends out the links with the helpful information, that will be one of the links. But I'm most concerned about the max group size, even if it's on a temporary basis, at 10 children. And I would like to propose to those in the audience to think of a way to manage around that, because the economics of our centers require that the older kids have 20 in a room. In some states it's 1 to 12, some states it's 1 to 10. And so I would encourage you to think of a way to still have 20 kids if God willing, that your enrollment allows it. And maybe instead of having all 20 in that classroom, which would violate the rules, is you have a heavy rotation of the outside space. Obviously for infants and toddlers, that's going to be a little more difficult, but that group size of 10 is very troubling to me, and I think we need to manage around it. We're hearing from a lot of our subsidy providers that the states and counties are continuing to pay for enrollment rather than attendance. And we have some clients, particularly in California, who've told us that the state is more interested in keeping those spots open, and there hasn't been a lot of scrutiny over who's actually attending. And we find this ironic because for many years, the subsidy programs were viewed as difficult administratively. The state may not pay on time, and there were all kinds of troubles for the subsidy program. So here we have one circumstance where the subsidy program is actually helping many of those providers. So if we could back up one slide, please. Then what we are finding is that the high demographic areas are able to come up with some creative strategies to continue earning revenue from seat licenses, distance learning, outright grants. I don't hear too much anymore about people charging without providing some sort of service. So in the first couple of weeks of the whole episode, when we still had some schools that were collecting money but without providing service. So we think that's gone away. And the result of this is we're going to have the middle market getting squeezed. And our idea for many of you who have avoided the subsidy is to look at that a little more carefully. It might be 3 months or 6 months before we really get back to normal. And if there are families in your neighborhood that could use your services, you may find that the subsidy program is a good way to fill in those missing gaps. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the macro condition. We're not going to belabor it. It's very challenging for everybody. Mom and dad are maybe stuck at home. Some states are starting to open. But even if they are open, mom and dad don't know if they should bring their kid into the center. They don't know if they should go to work. And as a result, many of you who are tenants are facing revenue declines of 75% or more. It makes it very difficult to pay the rent on time. So here are some micro strategies to help deal with paying the rent to your landlord. In a minute, I'll talk about the corollary of paying your mortgage to your lender. But in terms of the tenant-landlord relationship, it's an overused cliche, but that relationship and that communication link with your landlord is even more critical than before. And I don't mean an email. I think a person-to-person phone call, or even having your landlord come to the center if it's open, to show the landlord what's happening at the center. That instead of, I'll make it up, 120 kids, you've got 10. And there's just no way that you're going to be able to continue to pay the rent level that is indicated on the lease contract. So put yourself in the shoes of the landlord, and you don't want your tenant to go out of business, but you don't want the tenant to take advantage either. And so the way that the rent, we'll call this rent relief, the way that it works is you're going to have to provide some financial information to the landlord in order to prove your case. Let's not be afraid of it. When we're talking about foregoing rent for 3 months or 6 months, that's going to be a major dent in the landlord's cash flow. The landlord's got obligations. And if you want to get the landlord on your side, nothing is going to speak louder than a financial statement. And what I mean by that, ideally, is a profit and loss. We call it a P&L. Sometimes it's called an income statement. And if you can break it down month by month, that shows how much revenue you received in January and February and March and April, and how much you had in expenses over that time period, it will be plainly obvious to the landlord that your ability to pay the rent is temporarily, let's hope temporarily, curtailed. And what you need from that landlord is a bridge to get to a more stable operating environment. And when the whole episode started, we were hearing circumstances of tenants asking for 3 months of rent relief. Well, my personal opinion is you might be better off to ask for 6 months, and maybe it's 3 months of 100% rent forgiveness or deferral, and 3 months more at 50%. We've heard of some people doing 6 months at 50%. And we'll get back to what happens on the backside of that. Another strategy, putting rent aside, is taking a look at your other building expenses. So rent or the mortgage is usually the second highest expense after labor. But you also have other ongoing expenses. Hopefully, you've already changed your janitorial service to reflect lower student population, but you might need a more intensive cleaning. We encourage you to look at your HVAC contracts and servicing and landscaping servicing, and we encourage you at the right time to rebid these contracts. We have heard from many clients who say, Joe's done my landscaping for 10 years, he does a great job. That may be the case, but every every 2 or 3 years, and frankly, during this time of crisis, right now, or at the end of your contract, if you have one, you might be surprised at how some of your vendors are willing to help you mitigate this cash flow crunch. So we want you to look at every expense item, start with the most expensive and work your way down. Labor is its own separate category, of course, but start with those larger expenses and work your way down. And, pretty soon every 50 bucks, every 100 bucks, that's going to add up to a fair amount of money in the long run. The loan programs will, hopefully you've been approved for your PPP and various other federal loan programs. This seminar is not meant to address those in detail. We do have other resources for that. My personal opinion is that that's in the past now, and hopefully if you qualified, you're able to get it. Moving forward, I think the response from Washington, D.C. will be slower and not less complicated. So next slide, please. So here's some details on how a lease modification can work between a tenant and a landlord. One idea we talked about was there's rent relief for 3 months. There's zero rent paid, none. And a second option would be, I'm going to request from my landlord 50% rent payment for X number of months. Let's say it's 6. And that'll get you through until the end of the year. So whether you're in a position to pay some rent, I think you'll get a much better reception from your landlord if you're able to pay some amount of rent. Those of you who might be on a subsidy student roster may have more money coming in than those of you who are in the middle market, or those of you in states where you're closed, in Maryland or Illinois. If you are closed, I would go to the landlord and say, I cannot pay you any rent, zero. All right, in exchange, the landlord is going to try to recover some of that money. It's a balancing act. So what we've seen in the marketplace is that the expiration date of the lease is usually being extended for 2 times the number of free months. This is a way for the landlord to ensure the security of you staying on as a tenant. And frankly, in many circumstances, you're probably not going to want to move either. If your lease is up in, let's say your lease is up in 2 years and you have to add another 6 months or 9 months onto it, maybe that's not such a bad thing. You guys can negotiate what that rent would be for that extended period of time. Maybe it's whatever the last month would have been, and that rent stays flat. For those of you that may have 10 years left on your lease, that may be a more challenging conversation, but this is a give and take. You're going to need some instant rent relief and credit from the landlord. In exchange, you're giving him a future promise that you're going to stay in the building. Now, many of the landlords are not going to just let the rent go unpaid. So we have seen structures where the amount of deferred rent is amortized back into the remaining lease term. So in round numbers, let's say your rent is $100 a month and your landlord agrees to not charge you for 3 months. So you still owe the landlord $300, and you've got, let's say, 2 years left on the lease, and you get 6 months of added time added to the lease. So now you've got 30 months left on the lease. You owe the landlord $300. You amortize the $300 into the 30 months as a way to repay the landlord for this current period relief. We're suggesting the landlords don't charge interest, late fee, that seems to be adding insult to injury. And if the tenant's able to continue to pay the real estate taxes and the CAM, common area maintenance, then that would be crucial to the landlord. Many of our leases these days require the tenant to not only pay the rent, but also pay the property tax and the outside maintenance. So if there's a way for the tenant to continue to pay those expenses, that's going to make it easier for the landlord to give you a holiday on the rent. Be prepared, tenants, that when you ask for such modifications, that some of the specialty clauses that might be in your lease will be subject to renegotiation. And those include the renewal price for the lease. In many cases, the renewal option is based on a fixed number, no matter what the market is. Well, that can sometimes be a ceiling on what the landlord might receive compared to a market level negotiation. So be prepared to give that up, because that's going to be in the future. We also have many leases where the tenant has a ROFR, R-O-F-R, which is the right of first refusal. Many times the tenant wants to have the ability to buy the building, but that is it's an obstacle to the landlord in if he wants to sell that building on the open market. So the tenant's going to have to give on some of those back-end benefits in order to get current cash relief today. Next slide, please. Okay, so we like to focus on this adage about solving your customer's problem rather than your problem. And so you, customer, mom and dad, the ability to think that the center is going to be a safe and clean place. And if you can do that, then you're going to solve your problem as the operator. So we like to be customer-centric and customer-facing, which will enable us to succeed in our line of business. And so some of the specific ideas that we've heard from other clients and that we've seen be successful are, let's have a grand reopening. Look at some of these restaurants that are opening, and they're moving the tables outside and they're setting up balloons and a festive atmosphere. Well, we can use some of those ideas in our industry. After all, our teachers love a party. They have a party for any old reason. So let's have a grand reopening. We love the idea of balloons and ribbons, very eye-catching, festive. Let's put a smile on our face. We like to emphasize the outdoor classrooms, especially coming into the summer season. We have many clients who are meeting the children outside on the playground. So the path of entry now, instead of going through the front door, parents drop off in the outside playground. I imagine, especially with the group size of 10, that we're going to see a lot more utilization of the outside real estate as a means to overcome the operational challenges. The emphasis on cleaning goes without saying. We're going to have some ideas for you later on in the webinar about some automatic cleaning ideas and some changes in systems. We've also heard from folks who say that they are offering up gift certificates where the family would pay in advance for future hours, and there's a discount involved. We've also seen where there's a pay it forward type of contribution from some of the families to help some that might be less fortunate. So think of some ideas to jumpstart and reopen your center, not with a whimper, but with a party. Next slide, please. Okay, so for those of you who are listening and you are a landlord, maybe you've sold the business and a national tenant is in operation, or you're an investor. We strongly encourage you to keep your tenant alive. One of the beauties of the real estate in a childcare center is that if the tenant's in place, it's 100% full. It's not like a strip center with multiple tenancies, and at any given time there may be a storefront that's empty. So the attractiveness of the real estate is with a thriving operator, it's 100% full. Many times the tenant's paying the taxes and the CAM, and you just get a rent check. However, one of the challenges of the childcare real estate is it is a special purpose building. It's a single tenant special purpose building. And so if your tenant goes out of business, especially during this time period, I don't think you will get a new tenant in a short amount of time. It may be vacant for 6 months. Even before the whole episode, if a childcare operator left the building, those buildings could sit empty for a year before somebody else came along to take it. So we advocate that the landlord should, within reason, and even if you have to stretch, keep your tenant alive. And if you have additional resources, is there a way that you can contribute to refresh the building? Maybe it's time for a paint job. Maybe it's time for the carpet to get pulled out and for the new luxury vinyl flooring to be added. Maybe it's time to refresh the outside. So as a landlord, we want you to think of your building as a living, breathing organism, and every once in a while it's going to need a refreshment. If you have those resources and your tenant is only experiencing a temporary setback, why not reinvest in the building, get additional time on that lease, and work collaboratively? All right, let's talk about your lender. So those of you who have a mortgage to pay, you're stuck between the proverbial rock and a hard place, right? Your tenant is unable to pay the rent, and many of our clients who are landlords, they don't have endless resources. So without the rent coming in, it's difficult to pay the mortgage. So we offer the same advice to the landlord in dealing with their mortgage holder as we do with the tenant dealing with the landlord. Communicate with the lender. Hopefully there's a person there. Some of you may have exotic CMBS loans or insurance company loans where you may not be able to get a person, but we encourage you to fight through the bureaucracy and try to identify somebody that's a decision maker. Because if you're going to modify the terms of your lease, then you will need the consent of your lender. Now, many times if you can't find the lender, it'll be difficult to keep the tenant waiting, and you may have to do something informal until you can get the lender to bless this deal with the tenant. So it's a little bit of finesse here, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying that, but many times the lender is not going to be responding as quickly. Just know that technically speaking, you're going to be in violation of your mortgage unless you bring the lender in and keep them in the loop. The types of mortgage modifications that we're seeing require the same processes. You've got to deliver the financial statements to the lender. You've got to show that the performance of the tenant has been adversely affected. In addition, be prepared to show your own personal information. If you're sitting on piles of cash and your tenant's contribution to the rent is only a modest piece of the puzzle, I would not expect the lender to give you a holiday. On the other hand, if this is your only asset and absent help from the lender, you're going to go into default, then the lender is more likely to give you a break. The lender does not want the keys. The lender does not want to operate the building. The lender wants their monthly check. So you may get a situation where your request to the lender might be 6 months deferral of interest and principal, and the rest amortized over the remaining balance of the loan if there's sufficient time. We don't really like the idea of deferring the mortgage and then have balloon payment when things get back to normal. I feel that that's just too heavy of a burden. We've also seen situations where the loans can get modified to be interest only, where the payment is declines because the amortization is put in deferral for a while. So there's lots of different ways to slice and dice it. In this period of very low interest rates, you may also consider whether you're a candidate to refinance. The SBA, surprisingly, still has very good loan options. And speaking of the SBA, we have heard from some of our clients that the SBA is actually, contrary to popular opinion, they've actually been quite easy to work with in terms of loan modifications. So the ability to refinance your loan with rates at historic lows should be explored. Now, just because the rates are low doesn't mean the money is available. So you may need to shop around a little bit. Here's an idea for you landlords. Many times the tenant has given you a security deposit worth a month or two of rent, and you are supposed to keep that for return to the tenant when they move out. But in terms of an extra supply of cash, as long as your lease does not require you to keep it in a separate account, then you may have the ability to use that for working capital. Next slide, please. All right. The number one question that we get from landlords is, what's my building worth? What's it like in the market? When we talk to people who own the business and the real estate, we talk a lot about, do you want to keep the real estate and do you want to make that a piece of your family estate? What is the valuation methodology? When we talk to the public real estate investment companies who were and hopefully will be in the future active buyers of these types of buildings, we look at how they analyze the return on investment. And the most common metric used for that analysis is a cap rate. And a cap rate is basically a return on investment. And for those of you that were at our presentation in Miami, we did a big data search for the last 3 years showing 610 childcare buildings around the country that were sold. And on average, the cap rate or the return on investment was about 7.5%. So if somebody paid $100 for the building, they could expect to receive $7.50 per year in rent. Today, I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to say what your building is worth. because even though the price of money has gone down to historic, T-bill is less than 1%. Couple, in Miami, I think it was 1.5%. Last year, it was 2.5%. Historically, it's been, 4% in the last 10 years. And in the 80s and 90s, it was sort of in the 6% range. So we've seen this steady decline in the price of money, and yet everybody wants to hold on to their cash. So as a result, in the old days when you could put your building on the market and try to get somebody to buy it and they would earn a 7.5% yield, I think the caution in the marketplace now is so dramatic that the valuations have nowhere to go but down, and the return on investment has nowhere to go but up. So for that same $100 of building value, I think that the rent needs to be more like mid-8s, 8.5, maybe 9%, in order to attract somebody, because they're great. We hope and expect that things will get back to normal, but the simple question of what is my building worth depends. It depends. Who's the tenant? How long is that lease? Are they open? Can they get open? If they are open, how many students do they have? Is it subsidy? Are they even close to what their profit level was before? What is the stability of the rent? So these are really challenging issues in real estate valuation, and it ripples through all commercial real estate types. Restaurant buildings probably even more difficult. If you own the mall, we all know what problems the mall is having. At least we know for our industry that the children will come back, the parents want them to come back, the government wants them to come back. For now, it's very choppy. In having discussions with our clients over the last couple of years, in the case where the client owns the business and the property, many times the exit strategy was sell my business to a regional or national organization and enter into a sale leaseback on the real estate. And we felt that that was a very good family planning, family estate strategy. The opportunity to have regular recurring income from a national tenant was attractive to many families. Now, hopefully this crisis is a once-in-a-century crisis. But for those of you who are nervous about being a landlord, it might be worthwhile to think about, when it comes time to sell the business, maybe you want to sell the building too. And that begets a whole nother series of questions. Do you want to defer the tax through the IRS 1031 tax code exemption? Do you just want to pay the tax now since capital gains rates are fairly low? Do you want to put your money into some other type of investment? Do you just want to get out of everything altogether and reduce your risk profile? We look forward to having those conversations with you. Next slide, please. Okay, let's dive into the weeds a little bit. We've had many calls from clients who say, my lease has a force majeure clause, and therefore I don't have to pay the rent. So force majeure is a French word, and it roughly translates into extraordinary event. And if this crisis isn't extraordinary, I don't know what is. But careful reading of that force majeure clause, 95% of the time, it's going to say, notwithstanding the force majeure clause, the tenant still needs to pay the rent. And I think that as in the future, we will see more discussion on this issue about how do we introduce bacteria and virus into lease language? But I frankly, I don't think that either landlords or lenders are going to grant forgiveness in a legal contract. In practical terms, you may not be able to pay, but I don't see the landlord or the lender, or frankly, the insurance company, give an exemption for this type of situation. Quick digression here. We've had many clients say, I've got business interruption insurance. Isn't this the classic example of when my insurance should pay for business interruption? Well, no, because unless it's specifically named as a covered calamity, the insurance is not going to pay. I think there'll be some litigation on this, and there are some politicians making noise about the insurance company should pay, but that's going to violate a lot of contract law. So I do see, looking ahead in my crystal ball, just like those people in California, some want earthquake insurance, and some in the South may have certain types of flood insurance. We may see a pricing of a virus or bacteria insurance. I think it'll be painfully expensive in any event. For the landlords out there, if you have an unrealistic tenant or one who is maybe trying to take advantage, we're not afraid to suggest to you, even with the court system closed or clogged up, we're not afraid to suggest to put the tenant in default. And that sounds ugly and horrible, but these can be complicated situations. And if you don't have a collaborative relationship, then sending a legal notice to preserve your rights is going to be part of the ballgame. And you may need to get in line with a claim. If your tenant is struggling and you decided that you cannot be collaborative with them, and that it's unfortunate, but it looks like it might go from bad to worse, we suggest that you protect yourself, get an attorney, and take all action that's allowed under the law. If you're the tenant and you think you have a collaborative relationship with your landlord, always get it in writing, and make that you're not going to be in jeopardy if the lender doesn't eventually approval to this lease modification. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some ideas we have for our crystal ball, and pardon the scatological humor there. Those of you on the East Coast know that Foggy Bottom is the code name for the State Department, and so we're hopeful that some of these ideas might be useful. Again, higher security deposits might become a thing of the norm, and here we are. We talked about the pandemic or epidemic becoming a common phrase in force majeure and business interruption. I just don't know yet whether we can price it, and that will be curious whether the industry can appropriately price this kind of risk. What does it mean to be a credit tenant? We talked about many of our national clients who have excellent infrastructure and economies of scale, but yet they were impacted by this just like everybody else. So for you landlords out there, who is the tenant? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What can you do to help mitigate those weaknesses? And for the tenants out there, here's a bit that we all remember from Grandma. Remember when Grandma said, keep 6 months of expenses in the bank? Because Grandma lived through the Depression, and the savings rate for Americans was dismal. I saw a chart the other day that in the Depression, it was upwards of 25% of income was saved. And then over time, it's declined. And in the 90s and 2000s, that number was 5%. And I just saw this chart yesterday that over the last couple of months, the Federal Reserve, or I'm not sure who was measuring it, showed that the consumer is now saving 14% of disposable income. And I think that's going to hurt our discretionary shopping a little bit. But I think that all businesses need to reconsider grandma's advice, and let's have a little more money in savings. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some ideas for specific improvements that you could make in your real estate. There's a famous mantra in biology that says form equals function. And the reason I talk about that is, let's talk about how to improve the form of things like light switches. Like, can we install motion sensors so that we don't have 20 little grubby hands touching the light fixture? Same thing with doorknobs. Same thing with pens and pencils. Can we do more things electronically? How do we avoid touching things that we used to take for granted? And there's a lot of examples of this, and we'll be sending out some links for some ideas in that regard. We talked earlier about changing the operational flow of your real estate. In the old days, if we could use that phrase, in the old days, it was second nature. You open the front door, you walk in the front lobby, you check in the kid. Sometimes you take him to the classroom, sometimes not. I think that's going to go away. I don't think parents are going to be wandering through the halls anymore. I think that the child is going to be met at the front entry point. And the front entry point might not be the lobby. The front entry point might be the side door where the playground is. There might be touchless sign-in, right? We wave our cell phones to pay for groceries. Why can't we wave our cell phones to check in our child? Or for your staff, for you operators, why can't the staff sign in with a touchless iPhone? I had a customer in Southern California say that when they remodeled their center, they put solar tubes in some of the interior spaces, and it really brought in a lot more sunlight. And we've all heard about sunlight helping with the virus. So that's an expensive situation for your property, but I want to make sure that it's available there for you to consider. There's also kind of a fad going around, and I hope it bears some fruit, about UV light, and especially a band of UV called UV-C. There's even a handheld device on Amazon that provides UV light protection. There's some standalone devices as well. We'll give you more information on that. Next slide, please. Here's an idea that's, I stole this from Arizona when we were vacationing out there, and they had the misters on the patio. It was very hot. And I thought, why can't we have misters in the outside play areas that are spraying some sort of eco-friendly cleanser? Why can't we have the misters in the classrooms overnight? And if you don't want to go through the expense of installing this rubber gasket and tube situation, and many of you probably already are going around manually with the cleaning and disinfectant, I'm interested in ways where you can build this into the bricks and mortar so that it happens on an automatic basis. We have automatic sprinklers that come up from the ground. What about automatic disinfectant that comes down from the ceiling? Next, please. So we talked about doorknobs, And it's one of those things we take for granted. So up above, we have the old-fashioned classic doorknobs. We have the round ball, we have the lever, we have the thumb control. But then look at these three types of door handles at the bottom. You could operate them with a movement of your hip. If you're ambidextrous enough, you could, kick it open with your leg. So think of ideas that will enable you to reduce the amount of surfaces that get touched by everybody. I also read something that I haven't verified yet, but copper is not a surface that the virus can live on, as opposed to stainless steel. So we're going to have more information on that. Next slide, please. Okay, this one might seem radical, but let's talk about kitchens. Do we really need kitchens? Talk about the spread of germs. Do we really need kitchens in our buildings? Well, sometimes we do. If you're on the food program or you have a subsidy population, that food is probably an integral part of your practice. For those of you in a different demographic, maybe the parents bring their own food for the children, and there's less opportunity for infection or bacteria, virus to spread through the buildings. I think this is radical. If your building is already up and running and the kitchen's part of it, I think it'd be hard to convert into a revenue generating classroom. But for those of you looking to grow or expand, or you're going to go build a new building from scratch, it might be something to consider that in a typical 10 or 12,000 foot childcare building, you're going to have 800 feet for the kitchen, and you're going to have very expensive equipment in there, grease trap, you still need the 3-compartment sink, but the smoke hood and all the health department regulations. Maybe it's worth thinking about, I'm going to turn that 800 feet into a classroom, and parents will bring their own food for the children. Next slide, please. There is a product on the market called the Zono machine, and there are other brand names for a germicide cabinet. They're a little bit pricey, but you could maybe fold that into your overall marketing pitch. I expect that there'll be more demand for those kind of products. And the overhead UV light is something that could be turned on in the evening. We've also seen some products where they're on wheels. The efficacy of those is a little bit up in the air right now. I don't think it's going to hurt. Certainly, we don't want somebody to put their hand right on it. It's not a tanning bed situation. But I think we're going to see more products like this in the marketplace, and it will become partly science and partly marketing. Next slide, please. All right, this is a modest repeat of how we come to the conclusion on many of our real estate seminars. We need to think of a way to generate revenue on Saturday and Sunday. 2/7 of the week, our building is closed. That's 28% of the time. So we'd like to encourage you to figure out a way, whether it's a birthday party or a religious service or training or something. Let's open the building. Now, in today's environment with COVID, obviously a whole new set of challenges to have new people come through the building. I'm sure we can figure out a way to make that work. The second item is the Chinese phrase for crisis also means opportunity. I'm not saying we want to take advantage of somebody else or, create mischief for somebody else, but there's an opportunity there if one of your competitors isn't doing well or there's an empty building. Now's the time to strike. Remember, again, Warren Buffett, everybody likes to quote him, when there's fear, I sense opportunity. When everybody's happy and everything seems to be good, I'm fearful. So let's be prudent, but this could be an opportunity for growth. We've had many clients have great success with buying church buildings where the congregation has aged out. And especially in the Northeast and some of the older communities, sometimes those church buildings need a new owner and a new occupant. We have several clients that don't run away from flex buildings or industrial buildings. A flex building is one where there's usually some office space in the front and assembly in the back or distribution in the back. So it's not a pure industrial building. It's not a pure office building. It can be flexible. And those often are a little bit less expensive. They may not be on a prime retail thoroughfare, but we have plenty of clients that have childcare in those types of buildings, and they're demonstrably less expensive than the traditional, gingerbread standalone building on the main thoroughfare. We've had customers build metal buildings where the speed of delivery is much faster and the price is much less than traditional construction. The downside is, of course, on an exit, it's still a metal building, and those are perceived as not quite as desirable. But if you're going to be a long-term occupant, a metal building with a fancy cosmetic exterior has been proven to work in many circumstances. With all the crisis happening in public schools, we've seen a lot of cohabitation of spaces. This is especially prevalent in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think it's worth exploring for that in some of your older communities where some of the population may have aged out. We have many clients that sell corporate sponsorships, whether there's a tile in the front lobby or on the athletic field. There's lots of ways to generate revenue that don't rely on pure enrollment. So we'd like to encourage you to think of your real estate not just as a place for student enrollment, but also as a place for marquee, let's call it what it is, marquee advertising. And let's not be afraid to be creative in bringing in new revenue for our centers. Next, please. All right. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope that you all have brilliant questions.
Of course they do, Mike. Brilliance is everywhere. Thank you for that. That was fantastic content, and hopefully generate some ideas for people in using their real estate to navigate what's going on right now. We had a lot of really great comments going on in chat, and I apologize that someone has pointed out to me that you guys are only allowed to send your chat to us, and you were probably seeing my answers and not knowing what the question was. So we will get that figured out before next time, but I'll share some of these. So we had some great conversation going about what constitutes a divider for group sizes. So the first comment I'll make is that the 10 max group size is sort of universal right now. Most every state has adopted that, or 9 students to 1 teacher in most places. We did see that start to relax last week in a couple of states that have now made those rules a little looser. So maybe there's a 15 group size, or it's coming. So we have seen that. There was a lot of conversation about what constitutes a divider. One person commented that they could use furniture. We know from other clients that some states absolutely will not allow furniture. We had a great comment about rotating children inside and outside. And of course, that came from California. So we have to temper that with weather. We have some people we know that are able to use dividers like shower curtains. So I spoke with a provider yesterday that had put clear shower curtains with fish and things like that, and they were allowed to do that. So it really boils down to knowing what will be allowed in your area. And we believe that this will be a short-term issue, but about 2 weeks ago, we started having clients bump up against their capacity to bring families back that wanted to come back. And it seems like once that information gets to decision makers, they usually loosen that a bit. So good conversation going there. We had some conversation about some states are using the money that they received that came through the Child Development Block Grant Program to supplement tuition dollars for private pay families. So we've now heard that from 2 states, and that's fantastic. So as Mike mentioned, most subsidy providers continued to pay tuition or a portion, and that was fantastic. So we are seeing in a couple of states money allocated for private pay tuition now. We have, scrolling, we had some conversation about, so get your opinion of this, Mike. Thanks to Julie Roy. It's a great idea right now to do zero down deals with your landlord. Buy your building with zero down and have the seller hold the 504, which is SBA, 10% down note for you and a promissory note. All deals closed by September 27th will be eligible for 6 months, no payments from SBA. So what do you think about that creative idea, Mike?
I think that's very creative, and I know Julie has quite a real estate background. I feel that you would need to be upfront with the SBA that the 10% equity injection is satisfied by the landlord holding the second note there. My experience with SBA is they want new money in, but these are changing times. And if SBA is going to give a loan of 90% with none of the borrower's own money into the deal, then go for it.
Yeah, agree. We have a couple of comments about the specific disinfectants, and I will just say that we are hearing ideas like Mike presented about possible facility modifications. We also have clients who are using an approved disinfectant for restaurants, and they have purchased handheld or backpack sprayers, and they're actually disinfecting rooms during the day. So whether we don't have an opinion, of course, this is not our area of expertise about whether these products, which apparently are safe to be around food, are still okay in the classroom, whether they kill the virus or not. So there's a lot to know, and we are happy to share what others are using and products, but please be sure and check these out yourself and be sure that they meet your specific regulations in your area. I love this one, Mike. Give us your opinion of whether it's a better time to buy or lease real estate right now.
I like that question, and I'm going to try to avoid saying it depends. Okay, so I'll say it this way. If you have a motivated seller and you find a location that you think will be good for 25 years, and you have the resources either with a lender or personally, then I think that buying it makes a lot of sense, because if you find a landlord that is anxious to get out, there just won't be a lot of bidders. And the number of buyers out there may only be yourself. And therefore, your pricing discovery is going to be quite advantageous for you as the buyer. Now, if you're trying to grow your platform, or your lease is coming up for renewal, and your choice is, do I lease and stay where I'm at, or do I go to another building and lease there? I think the decision tree needs to be that if I don't want to buy the building, then, and I only feel that maybe it's a 10-year time horizon or 15-year time horizon, then I'm going to want the landlord to invest as much money as possible into fixing up that space so that I can lease it, and I don't have to come out of pocket for things that are going to stay behind. And so I'm thinking about paint and signage, obviously, but also things like upgrading air conditioning. If we get stuck with a group size of 10 and we have to build walls and the shower curtain idea doesn't stick, then we're going to need much better and more expensive air conditioning. And when you leave that building as a tenant, that equipment will stay behind with the landlord. So in those circumstances, I would argue that the landlord needs to make it worth my while as a tenant by investing in the space.
Thank you, Mike. Let's, okay, it just keeps going. A comment, Patty Kincaid, which could be Tom. Sometimes they share links and I find out later I'm speaking to the other one. But the comment was that they were lucky on their mortgage, and that the lender came to them, made the leases, the loans interest only starting in July, I'm sure probably for a certain amount of time. And also they had one landlord that left it up to them to offer what they could pay. So they are paying about a third of what they were paying before. So like Mike said, landlords don't want empty buildings back. You should find them to be pretty agreeable with something reasonable that they can live with as well, that doesn't put them in a financial hardship. Mike, could you explain if there's a difference in rent deferral and rent forbearance?
Yeah, my common interpretation of rent deferral means that the amount of the rent unpaid does not vanish into thin air, but gets repaid at a later point in time. And sometimes the forbearance implies that the rent is 100% forgiven. So I think we need to be clear with our terminology, whether it's a rent holiday. I've heard that expression. A rent holiday to me means I'm not paying any rent and I'm not going to repay you the unpaid amount. A rent deferral or a lease modification typically implies that at some point there's a catch up and the rent will eventually be paid. So when tenants and landlords are speaking with each other, let's be clear with our terms. And also, this is why we also write stuff down so that there's no confusion.
Great. And one more question that is this is my favorite question of weeks and months. So someone wants to know about the value of someone's real estate. So it sounds like someone else's real estate. So they're at the end of a lease to purchase agreement and looking for a way to evaluate the value of the building and the business. Banks will send an appraiser. They only appraise the building, not the business. How could that person possibly get that done, Mike?
Well, the first thing is they need to call Hinge, and we would be happy to speak about this circumstance. In general, here's some some tidbits. If the prospective buyer in question is the operator of the business and you're coming up at the end of the lease, I think you've got a lot of leverage. I think you've got a lot of power in that circumstance. If, on the other hand, the person in this hypothetical is an outside investor looking to buy the real estate, the key question for me is who's going to be in the building to pay the rent? And if the prospective buyer of the real estate intends to also be the operator, let's make sure you've built in enough time for startup expenses and ramping up. And how does that match up with the obligations and expenses you'll have on the real estate? So we'll circle back to the original comment, which was, give us a call and we'll brainstorm with you.
Yes. Thank you for that. And I said last one, but now I have a true last one. Could you share some ideas for leases that are coming up for renewal? So how would you think about those today? Would you be more creative? Would you, what would you do?
Okay, so for leases that are coming up for renewal, I see a variety of options. Generally speaking, incumbent tenants tend to be sticky. And what I mean by that is it's a pain in the butt to move your school to a new location. You got to re-equip it. It's generally not so exquisitely timed that you close on Friday and open up on Monday in a new location. So generally speaking, if your lease is coming to the end, find a way to stay in that building. Are the intrinsic characteristics of that building when you first went there, are they still valid? Does the neighborhood still support the children? Is the landlord reinvesting in the building? Does the ratio of the rent to the revenue indicate a sustainable future? Do you have enough visibility? Is bright and shiny moving in next door? So those considerations need to be evaluated. I would not wait until 90 days before the end of the lease. I feel that the more prudent operator is constantly looking around the marketplace to evaluate the pros and cons. But especially with only 9 months or 12 months to go on the lease, that's the time when you need to look around. Maybe you call Hinge, maybe you have a relationship with a local broker and understand what the opportunities are for you to move locations. Because if there are empty childcare buildings in your area, it's not just you that might be looking at them, probably somebody else. In general, though, I feel that the cost to relocate is an uphill battle. And so unless something is really structurally wrong, like the neighborhood has changed or the building's falling apart or there's an incredible opportunity, I feel that staying where you are and doing a lease extension at a reasonable number is my preferred method. And I would have to be talked out of that. So my strategy would be, all else being equal, stay where I'm at. And if something knocks me off that perch, then we want to have enough time to move and be successful at the new location.
I would add to that, and sorry if you said this because I was reviewing chat and questions to be sure we hit everything, but I think a lease renewal is a fantastic time to get your landlord to invest in your building.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you say that already?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a landlord myself, and I got a renewal when I was asked to put some money into renovating the building. And I just went to my bank and included it in the mortgage, gave them the money to do that, and then they pay rent on a bigger number. So they started to pay me more rent. So it's a great way for you to finance building improvements. Like Mike said, there's a lot of growth by new construction and big renovations going on, and you do not want to fall behind what parents' expectations are for your building right now. So wonderful content. Thank you so much, Mike. Reminder that tomorrow this webinar will be on our website and available on our YouTube channel as well. Carrie will email you the links that Mike mentioned along with a training certificate. Next week, we have our registration will start tomorrow for, if you missed it in the beginning, I want to say it again because I think this is such important information. It's not if, but when you will be navigating a virus situation in your school. And we will interview Alita Mechtel, who is going through that right now in real time. And she will share with us how she got her staff engaged, how she communicated with parents, what protocols were in place in advance, how they worked with local health officials, and what the outcome of the situation is that she's going through right now. So we appreciate her willingness to share with all of us how she is working her way through this right now. I know that several people have had teachers, 1 or 2 teachers maybe, that have been diagnosed. At the moment, she has some children in the classroom who are showing some symptoms that have not been verified, so we will know that next week. But I think she right now is navigating something that looks a little different from what we've seen in some of our other client schools. So we want you guys to be armed with a plan so you know how to put it in action quickly when you're faced with an event like that. So sign up for that for next week. I will check here real quick because very helpful. Love Alita. Yes, we do. Thank you for your very nice comments. We're excited as well. Mike, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and putting that together for our friends. And if you guys have particular individual situations that either didn't get addressed or you don't really understand some of the comments, or your situation is slightly different, certainly reach out and we'll be happy to support you in your efforts with your real estate. Be well and safe, and we will see you guys next Tuesday.